The morning of March 17th, 1944, First Lieutenant Robert Harrigan watched his squadron of B-17 seconds climb through 22,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley, and he knew the mathematics of his survival had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. Below, German Flak batteries were tracking his formation, preparing to fill the sky with exploding steel. Standard doctrine said those batteries would fire timed shells set to detonate at predetermined altitudes. Standard doctrine said Harrigan and his crew had maybe a 3% chance of taking a direct hit from any single shell. Standard doctrine was about to become catastrophically obsolete. The German gunners below weren't using timed fuses anymore. They were using something the Americans had invented, something the Germans had captured, reverse-engineered, and were now turning against the very bombers whose ships had pioneered the technology. Proximity fuses. Shells that didn't need to score a direct hit, shells that sensed when they were close enough and detonated automatically, spraying fragments in a 70-foot killing radius. The economic paradox was staggering. American ships in the Pacific had used $15 proximity fuses to destroy $100,000 Japanese kamikaze aircraft with devastating efficiency. Now, in the skies over Germany, that same technology threatened to make the entire strategic bombing campaign billions of dollars in bombers, tens of thousands of trained aircrew statistically unsustainable. Each B-17 Flying Fortress cost $200,000 to build in 1943. Train a 10-man crew, fuel the aircraft, arm it with bombs, and you were looking at a $250,000 investment per mission. German flak shells cost approximately $12 each to manufacture, slightly less than their American counterparts. But here's the killing mathematics. Before proximity fuses, German batteries needed to fire an average of 3,000 shells to down a single B-17. 3,000 shells at $12 each meant spending $36,000 in ammunition to destroy a $200,000 bomber. The exchange rate favored the bombers, barely. The Americans could afford to lose aircraft faster than the Germans could afford to shoot them down. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Proximity fuses changed that calculation entirely. German testing in late 1943 showed that shells equipped with these devices could increase kill probability by a factor of 5, the same improvement American ships had documented in the Pacific. Instead of 3,000 rounds per bomber, German batteries might achieve the same result with 600 shells. The cost to destroy a B-17 dropped from $36,000 to just $7,200. Suddenly, the economic equation flipped. The Germans could afford to shoot down American bombers faster than American factories could replace them. Harrigan didn't know any of this as his formation approached the target that March morning. He knew only that the flak seemed different somehow, more accurate, more deadly. The black puffs of exploding shells appeared closer to his aircraft than they should, bracketing the formation with a precision that violated everything his briefing officers had told him about German anti-aircraft capabilities. What he was witnessing was the collision of two technological revolutions. The proximity fuse, invented by American scientists to save American lives, had become a German weapon threatening to win the air war over Europe. This is the story of how a $15 electronic device nearly reversed the course of the strategic bombing campaign, and why the Germans ultimately failed to exploit the most dangerous technology they ever captured from the Allies. The strategic bombing offensive against Germany began with confidence that bordered on arrogance. American doctrine in 1942 held that heavily armed B-17 bombers flying in tight defensive formations could fight their way through German airspace in daylight, bomb precision targets, and return home with acceptable losses. Acceptable was defined as less than 5% casualties per mission. Lose 5 bombers out of every 100, and you could still maintain a sustainable operational tempo. The mathematics seemed sound. A B-17 bristled with 13 50 caliber machine guns. A combat box formation of 18 bombers created overlapping fields of fire that could, theoretically, shred any German fighter that came close enough to attack. And once the bombers reached their targets, German anti-aircraft artillery flak would engage them. But flak was predictable. German batteries used timed fuses that detonated at preset altitudes. Bomber formations flying at 25,000 feet faced shells that exploded in a fairly narrow altitude band, perhaps plus or minus 200 feet. Fly slightly above or below that band, or simply endure the barrage, and you'd probably survive. The early raids seemed to confirm this optimism. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17 seconds bombed the railroad yards at Rouen, France. All 12 returned safely. Mission commanders declared the concept proven, but Rouen wasn't Germany. It was occupied France, lightly defended, within range of British fighter escorts. The real test came a year later when the 8th Air Force began striking deep into German territory without fighter cover. The results were catastrophic. October 14, 1943, Black Thursday. 291 B-17 seconds attacked ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. 60 bombers were shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they never flew again. That's a 26% loss rate. The crews that did return reported something terrifying. The flak was getting better, not just more numerous, but more accurate. Shells were exploding closer to the formations than they should. Some crews swore the Germans had developed shells that homed in on aircraft, though intelligence officers dismissed these reports as combat stress and imagination. They weren't entirely wrong to be skeptical. The Germans hadn't developed homing shells. They'd developed something arguably worse. In the fall of 1943, German intelligence teams recovered an intact American proximity fuse from a naval shell that had failed to detonate during combat in the Mediterranean. The shell had been fired from an American destroyer at attacking German aircraft, splashed into the water near Sicily, and washed ashore where Wehrmacht engineers recovered it. What they found inside that shell nose astonished them. The device was smaller than a pack of cigarettes. 4 miniature vacuum tubes, a battery bigger than a book of matches, and a simple circuit that did what German engineers had thought impossible. It miniaturized radar technology down to a package that could survive being fired from a gun and then detect aircraft at close range. The implications were immediately obvious to the Luftwaffe's flak commanders. If this technology could be adapted to 88mm anti-aircraft shells, the effectiveness of every flak battery in Germany would increase dramatically. German industry mobilized to copy the American design. By December 1943, the first German-manufactured proximity fuses were undergoing testing at Peenemünde, the same facility where they developed V-2 rockets. The results exceeded expectations. Standard German flak shells used mechanical timed fuses, clockwork devices set before firing that detonated the shell after a predetermined number of seconds. An experienced gun crew could estimate target altitude, calculate flight time, and set fuses, accurately enough to create a barrage in the general vicinity of enemy bombers. But general vicinity wasn't good enough. Bomber formations were three-dimensional. Even if your timing was perfect for the center of the formation, aircraft on the edges might be 200 feet higher or lower. Your shells would explode harmlessly while those bombers continued toward their targets. Proximity fuses eliminated the guesswork. The shell would sense when it passed within effective range of any aircraft and detonate automatically. The fragments didn't need to achieve a direct hit. Shrapnel traveling at several thousand feet per second would perforate fuel tanks, sever control cables, wound crew members, and destroy engines from 70 feet away. German testing demonstrated that proximity-fused shells increased the probability of damaging or destroying a bomber by approximately 5 times compared to timed fuses. In practical terms, this meant German batteries could achieve the same defensive effectiveness with 1/5 the ammunition expenditure, or, more ominously, they could inflict 5 times the casualties with the same number of shells. The strategic implications terrified American planners once they realized what was happening. The combined bomber offensive, the round-the-clock bombing campaign by American and British forces, was predicated on the assumption that the Allies could sustain their losses while German industrial capacity degraded. If German flak suddenly became 5 times more effective, loss rates would spike above 15 or even 20% per mission. No air force could sustain that. You'd lose your entire bomber fleet in 5 missions. But there was a problem with the German proximity fuse program, a problem so fundamental it would ultimately save the strategic bombing campaign. The Germans couldn't manufacture them fast enough, and the shells they did produce were plagued by reliability issues. American industry in 1943 was producing over 1 million proximity fuses per month. German industry, hammered by Allied bombing, struggling with raw material shortages, and lacking the specialized manufacturing infrastructure, could barely produce 10,000 units monthly. Moreover, the German copies didn't work as well as the American originals. The vacuum tubes were less robust, the batteries were less reliable, quality control was inconsistent. Where American proximity fuses had a failure rate below 2%, German versions failed as often as 20% of the time. That meant 1 in 5 shells simply wouldn't detonate even when passing directly through a bomber formation. Still, even a flawed proximity fuse was better than a timed fuse. And the Germans had another advantage. They knew exactly when and where to use them. American bomber formations followed predictable routes. They had to. Assembling hundreds of aircraft into coordinated formations required precise navigation and timing. German radar stations tracked these formations from the moment they crossed the coast, calculating their altitude, speed, and probable targets. Flak batteries along the route could prepare their guns, loading proximity-fused shells specifically for the expected altitude band. The Germans began deploying their proximity fuses strategically in early 1944, concentrating them at the most heavily defended targets: Berlin, Hamburg, the Ruhr industrial region, oil refineries, and synthetic fuel plants. These were the targets that mattered most to German war production, and the targets American planners most needed to destroy. The first American crews to encounter German proximity fuses didn't understand what was happening. They reported shells exploding with unusual accuracy or uncanny precision. Intelligence officers initially attributed this to improved German radar fire control systems. It wasn't until late February 1944 that a German proximity-fused shell was recovered intact from a crashed B-17 near Magdeburg and shipped back to England for analysis. American ordnance experts examining the device experienced a moment of genuine shock. The Germans had copied their own technology and were using it to devastating effect. Worse, the copies were good enough to work most of the time, and German batteries were learning how to deploy them with maximum tactical efficiency. The weapon American scientists had invented to save lives was now killing American airmen at an accelerating rate. Technical analysis of the captured German fuse revealed both its capabilities and its limitations. The German version operated on the same fundamental principle as the American original. A miniature radio transmitter broadcast continuous waves that reflected off nearby aircraft. When the return signal strength indicated the shell was within effective range, the circuit triggered the detonator. The German designers had made several modifications to adapt the American design to their 88mm flak shells. The operating frequency was shifted slightly to 195 MHz instead of the American 180 MHz, possibly to avoid potential interference if shells from both sides were in the same airspace. The sensitivity was calibrated differently. American naval proximity fuses were designed to detonate within 70 feet of relatively small, fast-moving fighter aircraft. German anti-aircraft proximity fuses needed to engage much larger, slower bombers. The engineers adjusted the circuit to trigger at ranges up to 90 feet, spreading the fragmentation pattern across a wider area. The vacuum tubes were German-manufactured versions of American designs, slightly larger and heavier because German glass and manufacturing techniques couldn't achieve the same miniaturization. This made the complete fuse weigh nearly 3 pounds, instead of the American 2.2 pounds, which affected shell ballistics marginally. The battery chemistry differed. Americans used magnesium and silver chloride. The Germans, facing silver shortages, developed a zinc and mercuric oxide alternative that worked adequately, but had a shorter shelf life and was more temperature sensitive. The detonator interface was redesigned to fit German shell specifications, but the basic explosive train primer, detonator, and booster functioned identically to standard German Flak ammunition. What made the German proximity fuse dangerous, despite its shortcomings, was how Flak batteries learned to employ it. Traditional timed Flak created a barrage, a three-dimensional box of exploding shells that bombers had to fly through. The goal was volume of fire. Shoot enough shells into the sky, and some would detonate close enough to damage aircraft passing through that space. Proximity-fused Flak didn't need volume, it needed placement. German batteries began firing smaller numbers of proximity-fused shells interspersed with standard timed shells. The timed shells created the barrage that forced bombers to maintain formation and altitude. The proximity shells lurked within that barrage, waiting to sense aircraft. A bomber evading one exploding shell might fly directly into the detection radius of a proximity-fused shell that then detonated at optimal range. The psychological impact was significant. Bomber crews had learned to cope with timed Flak through a combination of tight formation flying, random altitude variations, and the knowledge that most shells exploded harmlessly. Proximity-fused Flak felt different. Crews reported shells that seemed to follow their evasive maneuvers or detonate with impossible timing. This wasn't true, the shells couldn't actually track aircraft, but the autonomous detonation created that perception. Perception mattered in strategic bombing. Crews experiencing proximity Flak reported higher stress levels, more combat fatigue, and greater reluctance to fly missions over heavily defended targets. Some crews began refusing to fly, citing equipment problems or medical issues. The unofficial term was Flak-happy psychological breakdown caused by sustained exposure to anti-aircraft fire. The introduction of German proximity fuses accelerated this phenomenon. American commanders faced a brutal calculation. Bomber production was ramping up, but so was crew attrition. You could replace a lost B-17 inches a few months. Replacing a trained crew took longer 6 months minimum from recruitment through combat-ready status. If proximity-fused Flak increased casualties by even 20%, the crew replacement pipeline couldn't keep pace. The entire strategic bombing effort might collapse not from lack of aircraft, but from lack of men willing and able to fly them. The solution came from an unexpected direction, not defeating the proximity fuse technologically, but defeating it operationally through changes in tactics, timing, and targeting priorities. And ironically, the solution had been developing in parallel with the German threat, driven by entirely different problems. Long-range fighter escorts, specifically the P-51 Mustang, began arriving in theatre in late 1943. These aircraft could accompany bomber formations all the way to targets deep in Germany and back, engaging Luftwaffe fighters that had previously attacked bomber formations with impunity. The presence of escort fighters changed German defensive calculations fundamentally. Flak batteries could no longer concentrate purely on the bombers. They had to watch for American fighters that might strafe their positions. This divided attention reduced the number of proximity-fused shells German batteries could dedicate to any single bomber formation. More critically, American fighters began deliberately attacking Flak positions. A diving P-51, strafing a battery with 50 caliber fire, forced the gun crews to take cover, interrupting their firing solutions and reducing the density of shells in the air. Fewer shells meant fewer proximity-fused rounds in the lethal zone around bombers, which marginally reduced casualties. Tactical changes in bomber formations helped as well. Instead of flying straight and level through Flak zones, the standard approach in 1943 formations began executing coordinated jinks and altitude changes while over targets. These maneuvers didn't prevent proximity-fused shells from detonating nearby, but they created unpredictability that complicated German fire control solutions. A battery aiming at a formation's projected position would find empty sky when proximity shells detonated because the bombers had already moved. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The most effective countermeasure, though, was simpler. Hit the Germans faster than they could hit back. By spring 1944, the 8th Air Force was launching missions with 700, 800, sometimes over 1,000 bombers simultaneously. Even if German proximity fuses increased kill rates five-fold, they couldn't shoot down 1,000 aircraft. The mathematics of attrition shifted back in favor of the attackers through sheer, overwhelming numbers. German flak batteries faced impossible choices. Concentrate all your fire, including precious proximity-fused shells, on one formation, and 3 other formations bomb their targets unopposed. Spread your fire across all targets, and you lack the shell density to achieve kills. The Germans chose concentration, defending the highest priority targets with everything available. This created predictable patterns that American mission planners could exploit. Briefings in early April 1944 began, including a new warning: expect enhanced flak accuracy over primary targets. Enhanced was a first of eyes, bureaucratic euphemism for proximity fused. Crews understood what it meant. The shells would find you even if you weren't exactly where the Germans expected. April 11th, 1944. The target was Oschersleben, a Focke-Wulf aircraft factory deep in central Germany. 385 B-17 seconds made the run. German flak batteries defending the plant had been resupplied with proximity-fused ammunition specifically for this raid. Intelligence had warned the 8th Air Force the attack was coming. Radio intercepts had decoded German preparations. The bombers went anyway because the factory had to be destroyed. The flak over Oschersleben that day was described in after-action reports as the most accurate defensive fire yet encountered. Shells were detonating within formations, not around them. Aircraft that maneuvered to evade one burst flew into another. The kill zone seemed to follow the bombers. 43 B-17 seconds went down over the target or crashed before reaching England. Another 71 sustained major damage. That's a 29% casualty rate from a single mission. Captain Michael Russo piloted a B-17 called Hell's Bell through that barrage. His aircraft took shrapnel hits from 3 proximity-fused shells, none of which scored a direct hit. The fragments punched through the fuselage in 17 places, severed hydraulic lines, wounded 2 crew members, and destroyed the No. 3 engine. Russo kept the aircraft flying on 3 engines for 4 hours back to England, where he made a wheels-up landing because the hydraulic system had bled dry. In his debriefing, Russo reported something that would prove significant. The flak wasn't random. The shells were tracking the formation's altitude. When we climbed to evade, the bursts climbed with us. When we descended, the bursts followed. He was describing the reality of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. The shells weren't tracking aircraft they couldn't, but they were, detonating at the precise moment they sensed targets, creating the illusion of intelligent pursuit. The illusion was almost as damaging as the reality. Bomber crews began developing superstitious behaviors, convinced that certain evasive maneuvers attracted flak, while others offered protection. None of it was true. Proximity fuses detonated based on reflected radio signals, not pilot actions. But the human mind craves patterns, especially when facing death. If you survived a mission by banking left during the bomb run, you'd bank left again next time, attributing your survival to that action rather than random chance. German industry struggled to scale proximity fuse production through the spring of 1944. The specialized components, miniature vacuum tubes, compact batteries, precision resistors required manufacturing capabilities that Allied bombing had systematically degraded. A single proximity fuse needed 4 vacuum tubes. Each tube required tungsten filaments, specialized glass, and precision assembly in clean room conditions. German factories could produce perhaps 50,000 complete fuses per month by May 1944. That sounds substantial until you calculate how many flak shells Germany fired monthly, approximately 6 million rounds. 50,000 proximity fuses out of 6 million total shells meant less than 1% of German anti-aircraft ammunition used the technology. Flak batteries had to ration proximity-fused shells carefully, using them only against the most important targets during the most critical moments of an attack. Berlin's defences received priority allocation. So did oil refineries at Ploesti, synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr, and ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. Secondary targets received standard timed fuses exclusively. This created a predictable pattern that American intelligence exploited. By tracking which targets produced the most accurate flak, indicated by tighter burst patterns and higher damage rates, analysts could identify where Germans were concentrating proximity-fused ammunition. That information fed back into targeting decisions. Some high-value targets were deliberately avoided temporarily, forcing Germans to maintain expensive defensive postures that consumed stockpiled proximity fuses without achieving results. The tactical cat-and-mouse game reached peak intensity in June 1944, coinciding with D-Day. The 8th Air Force needed to support the Normandy invasion by destroying German transportation networks, fuel depots, and airfields. But these targets were scattered across France and Western Germany, stretching German defences thin. Flak batteries couldn't concentrate proximity-fused shells everywhere simultaneously. They had to choose. The Germans chose wrong. They prioritized defending industrial targets deep in Germany, assuming the Americans would continue the strategic bombing campaign even during the invasion. Instead, the 8th Air Force shifted priorities to tactical targets directly supporting ground operations. Rail yards, bridges, and communication nodes received sustained bombardment, most of which faced only standard timed flak. Loss rates dropped to 3% per mission, sustainable indefinitely. By July 1944, German proximity fuse production was collapsing. Allied bombing had destroyed 2 of the 3 factories manufacturing the specialized vacuum tubes. The third factory, relocated to underground facilities, struggled with quality control. Rejection rates exceeded 40%. Tubes that passed inspection still failed in combat at unacceptable rates because underground facilities lacked proper humidity and temperature controls needed for precision electronics assembly. Battery chemistry became another bottleneck. The zinc mercuric oxide batteries German engineers had developed worked adequately in testing but degraded rapidly in field storage. Fuses manufactured in April would have dead batteries by August if not used. This created logistical nightmares. Flak batteries couldn't stockpile proximity-fused ammunition. They had to use it quickly or watch it become worthless. Some commanders, unaware of the shelf life issue, hoarded proximity shells for emergencies that never came, only to discover their carefully preserved ammunition was inert when finally deployed. The final nail came from an unexpected source: German procurement bureaucracy. Proximity fuses cost approximately 40 marks each to manufacture, more than 3 times the cost of standard timed fuses. In an economy already straining under total war mobilization, that price difference mattered. Procurement officers demanded justification for the expense. Flak commanders had to prove proximity fuses were worth the additional cost through detailed after-action reports showing improved kill rates. But measuring effectiveness in combat was nearly impossible. A bomber formation flying through a barrage of 500 shells might lose 10 aircraft. Which shells caused the kills? Were they proximity fused or standard timed rounds? Without controlled testing impossible in combat conditions, no one could definitively prove the proximity fuses justified their cost. The procurement bureaucracy, faced with ambiguous data and competing resource demands, began cutting proximity fuse allocations in late summer 1944. By October, German flak batteries were receiving perhaps 10,000 proximity-fused shells monthly for the entire Western Front. For context, The flak defences around a single target like the Leuna synthetic oil plant would fire 20,000 shells during one major raid. The proximity fuses, once a terrifying threat to the entire strategic bombing campaign, had become a rare luxury employed only in the most desperate circumstances. The final irony came in April 1945. With Germany collapsing, Allied forces overran flak positions across Western Germany and discovered warehouses containing thousands of unused proximity fuses. Some had dead batteries, others had been hoarded by commanders who never received orders authorizing their use. Still more sat in damaged packaging, destroyed by Allied bombing before they could ever be issued to gun crews. American ordnance teams catalogued the captured fuses and sent them back for technical analysis. The conclusion was striking. German copies of American proximity fuses, despite their flaws, were fundamentally sound designs. If Germany had possessed the industrial capacity and raw materials to produce them in quantities matching American output millions per month instead of thousands, the strategic bombing campaign might indeed have become unsustainable. But Germany didn't have that capacity. The same bombing campaign that proximity fuses were supposed to stop had destroyed the industrial infrastructure needed to manufacture those fuses in decisive quantities. The weapon that could have won the air war for Germany was defeated not by superior Allied technology, but by Allied industrial supremacy and the grinding logic of strategic attrition. The legacy of German proximity-fused flak extended well beyond World War II. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that German air defences, including proximity fuses, destroyed or damaged approximately 18,000 Allied aircraft during the war. But the study also noted that German industrial output, despite the bombing, actually increased through mid-1944. The strategic bombing campaign hadn't achieved its primary objective of crippling German war production until the final 6 months of the war. This raised uncomfortable questions. If proximity fuses had been deployed in greater numbers earlier, could German air defences have inflicted unsustainable losses on Allied bomber forces, buying Germany time to develop jet fighters, V-weapons, or other war-winning technologies? Or was the outcome inevitable regardless of proximity fuse deployment, because Allied industrial capacity would always overwhelm German defences through sheer numerical superiority? The Cold War military establishments on both sides studied these questions intensely. The Soviet Union, having obtained both American and German proximity fuses through various means, developed their own versions for air defense of Moscow and other strategic targets. American defense contractors evolved proximity fuse technology into increasingly sophisticated systems. The Nike surface-to-air missiles of the 1950s used proximity fuses with detection ranges exceeding 300 feet. Modern air defense missiles employ descendants of those original vacuum tube circuits, now solid-state and digital, but operating on identical principles. The fundamental lesson remained constant. In air warfare, the side that can deliver precision effects with minimal resource expenditure holds an insurmountable advantage. A $15 fuse that increases kill probability 5-fold changes the economic calculus of aerial combat more than any increase in raw firepower. The Germans understood this intellectually, captured the technology, replicated it successfully, and still lost because understanding a principle and possessing the industrial capacity to exploit it at scale are entirely different challenges. Lieutenant Harrigan, whose bomber formation encountered German proximity fuses over the Ruhr in March 1944, survived 35 missions and returned home in November of that year. In a 1989 interview, he reflected on the experience. "We knew the Germans were using some kind of improved flak shells. We didn't know they were our own technology turned against us until after the war. In a strange way, that made it easier to process. We'd invented something brilliant to save lives in the Pacific, and the enemy was smart enough to copy it. That wasn't treachery. That was just war being war. The best idea wins, if you can build enough of them fast enough. We could. They couldn't. That's why we're having this conversation." The proximity fuse, American invented, German copied, deployed by both sides to devastating effect, epitomized the industrial and technological race that defined World War II. Not the most powerful weapon, not the most sophisticated technology, but perhaps the clearest example of how brilliance in design means nothing without the capacity to manufacture at scale. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.